Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anita Lee. I'm the Chief Programming Officer for Tiff, and I could not be more excited to moderate the press conference for My Policeman. Before we begin the program, I'd like to just share a few housekeeping items. A reminder to press in the room, the embargo for My Policeman lifts after the first public screening, which takes place at the premiere tonight. Please hold on to your reviews, stories about the film until then. A very big thank you to our media partner, Twitter. We are so excited to be live streaming this press conference at Tiff Industry. As a reminder, please, no photography or filming of any kind. All of our questions have been submitted in advance, and thank you so very much. Adapted by Ron Nyswaner, Philadelphia, Freeheld, from the Bethan Roberts novel and directed by Michael Grandage, with restraint and understated elegance, My Policeman builds as it lets its characters accept the truth about one another, and in its final moments, we are allowed to witness the quiet power of a love that can be finally embraced. Please join me in welcoming Linus Roache, Rupert Everett, Gina McKee, David Dawson, Harry Styles, Emma Corrin, and director Michael Grandage. When I first saw the film with the team here at TIFF, there was literally a moment of silence after the film ended. We were so profoundly moved and immediately agreed that what it really inspired was such a strong sense of love and courage. I'd like to ask my first question to Michael. What drew you to this story? Tell me about how this story resonates with you personally.
That's me down here, Anita. Hello. Hello.
Yes.
That was for me, was it?
It is for you, Michael.
Thank
yes.
you. Hello, everyone. What first drew me to the story was, I guess, a personal connection of some kind, because I was born into the England that is represented at the start of this film. And as a gay man, that meant a great deal, obviously, because in the last 60 years, we've made an incredible change to what it was like then. The law was changed in 1967. There was then at least a generation of kind of continued prejudice. But slowly, things started to change. Things started to move forward, and the world we find ourselves in now is very different to the one that's represented in the film in 1957. Although for the first time in my life, I think that is a little fragile at the moment, and that is part of what drew me to this film, because I felt the film is many things, but it is great when a film can be part of a debate. And I think, certainly I hope My Policeman can be part of a debate that's going on right now. But that's just one thing that attracted me to the film, personal.
Yes, and on that, as you saw, the story moves between the 1950s, when homosexuality was illegal in the UK, to the 1990s, when it became much more accepted in general society. On that note, I'd like to ask a question to Rupert, Gina, and Linus. Why is it important for stories like this not to be lost with time? And maybe we can begin with Rupert.
Would you repeat the question? I was so worried about who was going to answer first.
Yes. Why is it important for stories like this not to be lost with time?
Oh, well, I think it's very simple. It's a great story. There's a lot of human suffering, and like Michael said, it's a fascinating journey to go on from modern homosexuality to 1950s homosexuality, and how far we've come, and that's very exciting in a story to see. Even though our side of the story is quite a depressed side of the story in a way. Don't you think?
I find that there is some optimism in there, but it's not at the forefront, perhaps. I think ultimately that there is, I'm trying to be, without, obviously I know you've seen it, but I know that people are recording this, so I'm trying not to give away too much. But I think that the end does show a certain amount of optimism, in that there's an attempt to address the past.
And for you, Linus?
I think I'd just echo that, really, that, culture evolves. Thank God. We've still got a long way to go, but that, over this huge amount of time, there's a little bit of redemption at the end. There's a bit of healing. There's a future. And I feel that's the power of the story. And also just to remember that however much we grumble about the times we're in, we're actually extremely lucky. So it's important to remember that.
Mm-hmm. I feel like younger audiences seeing this film will really appreciate the history and the journey that many went through to arrive here today. And I feel like that will really be a strong takeaway. Yes. The next question is, what initially drew you to this script? And we would like to have as many of the panelists answer that. So perhaps we can start with Harry.
Me? Yeah, I think what initially drew me to the script is, I think it's quite a, it's obviously like the themes in the film. I think, it's based in two different kind of time settings, but I think the general themes are incredibly timeless. I think that's why the film works so well. I think, the themes of love and freedom and the kind of search for that is incredibly relevant, kind of whatever time you were to set it in. And then I think, for me, a big draw to it was I think people are able to see a part of themselves in each of the characters. I think that's what is kind of the most beautiful thing about the story, is that all of the characters have some really nice qualities, and they also have some flaws that, we might hope not to have, but as humans we all have them. And I think at different points in the story you're able to see bits of yourself, and sometimes maybe not your favorite parts of yourself, in different characters. And I think that's why it kind of resonated with me so much. Was just, whether it's Marion's kind of, kind of like acceptance of, or kind of like going along with things kind of reluctantly, or, or all the different kind of like, kind of more deceitful parts of the characters, and all of that. I think there's just a very human aspect to all of them. I think that's probably what did it for me.
Emma, did you want to answer that question as well?
You put that really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think similarly for me, very relatable in many ways. Yeah, everyone's flaws and like the nuance and complexity of these young people living in a very strange time and trying to figure out who they are. Yeah, and I think I really like the joy that they find amongst themselves as a trio, and the joy in that friendship. I know that that's something we spoke about a lot in rehearsal. And then also that juxtaposed with like the tragedy in the end, and like, yeah, everything that they go through. I liked that there were those two sides of that. Yeah.
And David?
I think initially I wanted to do it because Michael was doing it. I've worked with Michael many times over the years, and it's always an absolute joy. And this was equally as special. But I think I was fascinated in playing Patrick to ask the question, how does somebody not only survive but thrive in this time? And exploring how Patrick can have two different personas, like the public persona in which he can achieve his ambitions and be respectable within that society, and then exploring the private man, the vulnerability, and someone who, like everybody, just wants to find love and beauty in the world. So that excited me.
Yes, fantastic. And just moving forward from that same question, and this is a question again for Harry, Emma, and David. Can you talk about playing such complex characters and the circumstances around the decisions they made and the challenges they faced at that time for your characters?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take it. Yeah, I think it's something that really drew me to Marion was that complexity because, yeah, especially in like what she ends up doing. I don't know if I'm allowed to spoil stuff or what we're doing with that, but we're all here. Yeah, the decisions that she makes, and that really intrigued me because I feel like I had to really think about like how to justify that with myself for her. Obviously, the time she was living in, I think she was such a product of her time and the society that she was functioning in, but also what really fascinated me with like her youth, and I really had this sense of her as like that first time you fall in love and the intensity of feeling that you experience, and then the fallout from that can leave you feeling so hurt and so fearful, and the fact that she was acting from that place and that driving her to do some of the things that she did. Yeah, so much complexity to work with. But then the great joy of this like friendship and the love that they all have for each other. And I think it's also rare to explore a love triangle where all those dots are joined up so equally. And I think that within the trio, they all have their own dynamic. And I thought that was really rare. And yeah, it gave us a lot to work with, which was cool.
Yeah, it certainly makes, I thought I was excited, hopefully for how an audience will respond to the journey they go on throughout their lives, you know, and scripts are very exciting when you know that an audience might, it's what Harry said before really, are conflicted perhaps in how they feel towards these individuals, but hopefully you understand it's because of the world in which they live that they made those decisions.
Yes, Harry.
Yeah, I think it kind of, you know, speaking on the position of Tom, I think he's a product of his time. I think that the nicest thing about kind of our three characters is kind of echoing what Emma said, but I think despite all the complexity and you know the kind of deceiving nature of like a lot of aspects of the kind of triangle between them, there's also just a lot of like very real friendship, I think, as well. I think, you know, Tom's love for Marion is very real, and Tom's love for Patrick is very real, and I think that part of why it's so painful in the story is because I think Marion and Patrick are actually very good friends, and there's like a very real love there as well. So I think just having that kind of duality of, you know, everything not being so kind of black and white in terms of, well, you've wronged me and that means I don't like you anymore, and all that kind of thing. It's not really how the world works and how human beings work. So I think there's so much nuance to them and so much complexity that comes for people in real life around, you know, sexuality and finding themselves and all of that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, around sex in particular and sexual relationships being, you know, shrouded in kind of fear for a man in that time, for Tom, for example, and fear and shame and all these things that you don't necessarily know that much about if you don't encounter other, you know, homosexual men at that time. It's for someone like Tom, it's all of his feelings towards men I would imagine feel just so foreign. So, yeah, I think just kind of anytime it's that complex and you're getting to play with like actual nuanced kind of human emotion is really nice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was really struck by the empathy and the tenderness I felt for each of the characters. And as you mentioned, the nuances and the layers. And I felt that was handled so beautifully in the performances and in the writing of the script as well. For you, Harry, this is another question. When we meet Tom in 1957, he's trying to escape the narrow world he's always known. Can you tell us about the search for his identity and the circumstances that held him back?
I'll try. I think Tom is. I think he's very curious, which is kind of. I think he's someone who is born into a very small world, and as if you're born into that kind of environment, it's hard to. I think you feel like you know where the edge of the world is, and slowly throughout the story, I think he's realizing that it's a little further away than, Brighton or kind of that coast. And I think, people live entire lives in very small bubbles like that, and if that's how you've been brought up, and everyone around you and the generations before you, your parents, etc., have all lived within that kind of small bubble, it's obviously very difficult to even picture the world outside of that. So I think when he meets someone like Patrick, who is well-travelled and likes art and finds himself kind of being curious about those things, it kind of just sparks this, it's kind of like feeding his curiosity, that it's not kind of strange for him to be curious about stuff. And then I think him with Marion, he also finds ultimately a friend who is the most accepting of him. And I think that's why, kind of, regardless of whichever way you kind of think on their relationship, I think their friendship is incredibly real and loving and tender.
And that, very profound search for identity for your character brings us to the 1990s, and this is a question for you, Linus. How did Harry's performance inform how you played Tom 40 years in the future, and how did that character grow?
Well, this might not be a direct answer to the question, but Michael said a very clever thing when he could have, of course, put a lot of prosthetics on these young people and made them play the older people, but it's kind of true that we become different people later in life. And what Harry brings is this, he naturally brings this, I think, sort of innocence and a sense of wonder. It's not naive, but he's very present in that. And it's a moment in time where there's so much potential. It's colourful. There's so much of a future that's there. And then what happens, and he gets frozen in time. So I got the job of taking on the man who's lived with a heartache and a heartbreak for 40 years. And it's quite something to contemplate. I think many of us who've been on the planet a little longer might know a little bit about that. But what's it like to embody it, but at the same time you're in denial of it? It's there as a deep ache, but he's got this friendship. He loves Marion. And, he's got a life. And suddenly the catalyst is brought in and everything is turned upside down. So it's a brilliant premise. That's what I love about the film, that it deals with such a big movement of time and of a large movement of life. And the way Michael brought us into the two worlds, he included us all in the way he was going to approach it. But it was very colourful and lively and bon vivant and fantastic in the 50s. And we're in this sort of dour, slightly trapped, inhibited. Even the way it's shot, we're sort of trapped inside our lives, but we have a love there. And so, I think in a way I wasn't trying to mimic Harry, or we talked about having a limp or a wink or something that would... But we decided in the end it's two completely different worlds that are united in the same universe somehow.
And, it made me think about, with your character, just wondering, how many more men or women, in our world today who may have had, such a passion or a secret. So I thought that was really very, very moving, and that very small shift in your character at the end of the film felt just beautifully handled and just the right note. Yes. For David, can you tell us about Patrick, the character that you play, and how he lives his life very differently than Tom? And what did you take away from this experience?
Well, we meet Patrick. He's a lot older than not a lot older, but a little bit so. But something I admire about Patrick, even though his life experience and it has been hard in the past, that he's not hardened. He's determined to always find the joy and the beauty of life in people or in music and art and literature. He loves to travel, and the difference between him and Tom, I suppose, when he meets Tom, he thinks he sees a lot of himself when he was a young man, and somebody who's at the beginning of a journey of self-discovery. And I think he wants to help that be as good and as beautiful and joyous as possible, even if that makes this triangle very complicated.
And can I move to the next question? This is for Emma. Can you talk about these characters and their journey for acceptance of themselves, acceptance of each other, and acceptance of the world? Emma first, and then Harry next, please.
Acceptance, yeah. I think, they all have very different journeys of acceptance, but also I think there are very similar themes running through all of them. I think for Patrick and Tom, obviously, it's acceptance of themselves in a society which is not allowing them to be themselves at all, to love who they want to love or be the way they want to be. And then for Marion, I think it's sort of accepting that, accepting that she is the product of a society which has determined a way that she thinks that ends up sort of driving some of her actions that she lives to regret for a long time during her life. I think that there's didn't Ron talk about he wanted to write it like a mystery, and how there's like this search for truth that follows the characters from when we meet them towards the end. Towards the end of the film, you really see them and how they've ended up sort of battling with truth and with themselves. And I think, Marion ends up living a lot of her life, never truly being able to own up to what she did to her friends, to herself. And it really follows her, that sense of guilt and that sense of confusion. I think when you meet her in the start of the film, she's incredibly young. And Marion has this beautiful naivety, but also this really intense stubbornness. I think she falls so in love with Tom and then is so convinced that it's going to work, and so convinced that he feels about her exactly the same way she feels about him. And I think then when she discovers the truth about him and Patrick, so much of her anger isn't really to do with their relationship, which is also something she doesn't really understand, because just of her lack of awareness, I think. But so much of it is to do with the fact that she was wrong and that all her worst fears were confirmed. And I think that's the anger that fuels her to do what she does, and then that's what she has to live with for the rest of her life. And then there's that moment at the end of sort of euphoria, that liberation, when she can finally let go. And that's really like, it takes her that long to accept herself, to almost let herself be, sort of find redemption and forgive herself, I suppose, and feel like she's righted some of her past. Yeah.
Yes, Harry, did you want to speak to that as well?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think Tom's version of acceptance is a pretty depressing one. I think it's, I think he accepts that he's going to deny this part of himself for a really long time. And I think it's kind of, it's like a quiet acceptance between him and Marion that it just won't be discussed, which, you know, is very, you know, it's like none of them were going to therapy, were they? I don't think. It's, I think just, you know, being in it. I think for me, like the story, the reason why the story is so devastating is because ultimately, to me, the whole story is about wasted time, and I think wasted time is the most devastating thing because it's the only thing we can't control. It's the one thing we can't have back, and you know, the one thing that I think matters, whatever kind of life you've lived, at the end is you think back on time with people you love and time that you spent. I mean, I'm assuming I haven't been at when I've died, but you get what I'm saying. But, you know, that is the one thing that none of us can control. So I think the whole story being about this wasted time, and I think, you know, going to the end and where, you know, you find Linus's characters, it feels like a brief moment of acceptance, which feels really wonderful, but it's also still kind of laced with this devastating, oh, if we were just, you know, braver, we wasted so much time. So I think there's just complexities in every part of the story, which I think is what makes it so interesting, is that every piece of joy, even though it's very real, it's kind of laced with this other side to it. So, yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Well said.
Thanks.
The idea of wasted time, I think, is especially interesting for Gina. So this question, this story is one of love and regret, and in some ways redemption. Gina, tell me about Marion's journey and what she may have felt when she decided to finally be free.
A lot of the things that we've already touched on are part of that answer, in that for decades there has been a unity and in some ways in equal measure a division because of the actions of their youth, and they're indelibly marked by that. And I think that state of inertia and their impending age forces Marion to be proactive, because, you know, it's very easy, as a lot of us will know, to go through life and before you know it 2 decades are gone and you've kind of just been busy doing life. You have a job and responsibilities and a routine, and finally Marion is retired, and I think there's something about that which is no coincidence, that is a catalyst. And I think it's very hard to go into older life, and certainly to your grave, without at least attempting to address some of the things that are needed to be said and done.
That beautiful moment when she drives away, I imagined all the potential scenarios waiting for her in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why I feel optimistic, because I think they will always be bound, but now they're bound by choices as opposed to victims of their time.
And on that, it's a question back to Michael. You handle the story telling from 2 different eras beautifully. Tell me why this was important to the story and how you made this decision.
Well, Linus talked a little bit about, and Harry, both of them eloquently, about, you know, what time does and how we change. And I felt I wanted the piece, to me, when I read it, it was a piece about memory and time and how the two are interconnected. And sometimes I'm now of the generation of the older group, and I sometimes can stand in the house I've lived in for over 40 years, and I can remember every single part of the last 40 years, and some days you can only remember it like you can only remember, you go straight to a place. And I think the way we play in our heads with time and memory is very sophisticated, actually. It happens in a way we can't control, but it also happens in a very sophisticated way. And I think the film operates on that level as well. It's about trying to take the audience is invited to fill in the missing years in a way. That's what's lovely about it. We make no attempt to try and address those 40 years. We start with them, with the whole world ahead of them, with all that youthful ambition, and then we see them not at the end of their lives. Actually, I think that's the important thing here. That's very crucial actually to the storytelling. We see them with still part of their lives ahead, and the decisions they make between those two periods. And certainly the decisions they make at the end are crucial to everything that's gone on in that whole period. So it's just a very it's a lovely thing to be able to play with and to be able to pick up certain nuances between the younger and older actors, and all of that is part of the way we're trying to craft the story of these two time periods. I mean, it is very interesting. I was at college with Linus, and so we were Harry's age, and he's fared much better, I ought to say. But when we look back at those times, and we are where we are now, they just don't feel like the same life sometimes.
Right.
I mean,
I'm not in college. I'm 28.
As subtle as it was, I really felt that sense of hope for me at the end of the film, and thinking about the characters and what their next steps might be. This is a question for Rupert, Gina, and Linus. Tell us what you hope audiences take away after watching My Policeman. How do you think audiences today will react to this film through the prism of our society now?
Rupert has elected me to answer that, and I was convinced you were going to do it. I always find it really very hard to say what an audience might take from any piece of work, and I can only really say what I hope or what I felt when I first read it. But I think that I hope that it provokes discussion. I hope that it gives people courage. I hope that it gives a lot of people understanding. And I hope that it makes people feel ultimately that there is some salvation there.
And I agree with what Linus said earlier. I think it's a great opportunity to see how much things have moved since the first part of the story, and that is essentially what makes you leave the cinema, even though the three characters might be quite broken by the experience, but with hope, because history, we are constantly changing, and I think people's historical context has become quite narrow since the virtual world descended on us, and so to have such a much larger vista, I think is really positive and helpful and inspiring for today, for an onward move, really.
At the time in 1999 in the UK, we had Section 28, which didn't get repealed until about 2003, I think. So I think that in their orbit, even then, even though there'd been a lot of advances in terms of helping people to live their lives if they were gay, without shame, there was a step back in the UK, and I think that somehow is also a motivator for Marion. I think by then she had evolved to understand a huge amount, and I think whenever we get that sensation that we're one step back, we need to make 3 steps forward. So I think the timing, Beth and Ron's timing within the writing is poignant.
Absolutely. I think just those subtle moments when you watch Marion taking in the new environment, you know, and seeing others now enjoying life in a different way. I thought it really resonated with me in those scenes. Really beautifully done. Linus, did you want to answer that question as well?
I think it's all been said, really, and we haven't talked about this film for a year and a half since we finished it, and I've just found it fascinating to sit here and sort of have so much said and expressed. And I just hope people talk a lot about it like this, because it's so rich, it's so complex, and art reflects life, and we learn through it. So I wouldn't say there's any one thing. I think there's lots of things that people can take from this, learn from this, talk about it, and makes you want to see it again. Absolutely.
And we know we at Tiff are incredibly excited to have the world premiere here. We would love to hear from all of you. How does it feel to have the premiere here at Tiff, to share the film with an audience, here to a global audience? And I'll ask that question first to Michael.
Well, it's always a difficult moment when you put your work out into the world. Difficult because, you've been with it. There's some of our producers have been with it for 9 years. I've been with it for 3. At least everybody here has been with it for 2. And there comes a moment where you have to go, here it is. And I couldn't be happier or indeed prouder of it happening here, because this is a place that really loves film, really takes their film seriously. And this festival is one of the most regarded festivals in the world, and to have our world premiere here is an absolute joy, to be perfectly honest with you. I can't say I feel safe, but I feel I feel we're in the right place. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to answer that?
I've just spent 2 months working here, so it's very exciting to be back, and it's a lovely town to be in and to work in, and so that's an extra thrill coming back to knowing it a little bit here.
I actually played the Princess of Wales Theatre. I played there 14 years ago on the stage, so for our premiere tonight to be there is really special.
Wow.
Well, we knew on the programming team that this film would be loved and just so widely appreciated by a Toronto audience. We were so excited to have the world premiere here. And on that note, thank you so very much for joining us today. This wraps up our press conference, My Policeman.